Punctuation marks do matter in English, and they can change the whole meaning. And at a certain point, especially in for English major students, they do affect the grades, right? So you will lose grades if you do not punctuate properly. So the question that I am going to start with today, and hopefully I'll reach the answer at the end of this nice, trip. I hope to reach the answer at the end, is basically, why do Arabs find difficulty using punctuation marks, right? So let's begin. Let's have a nice story. Let's talk a little bit about it. Let's just see what we got, right? So in the beginning, there was no punctuation at all, right? There were no spaces between words. There were no confusions. Nobody read, nobody cared. And those who cared knew how to read all along with no punctuation. But then it dawned upon a man in Alexandria, a smart and creative fella, I would say, that there was something called a dot, a period. And that dot to him meant all the difference. In the 15th, before the birth of Christ, 15th century before the birth of Christ, the name of that fella is Aristophanes. And that's a capitalization that I missed here. Aristophanes, the bearded librarian of Alexandria, that is. This fine folk proposed an idea about the dot. What if, he thought, we had a dot at the upper end of a word as opposed to the middle end of the word, as opposed to the bottom end of the word? Wouldn't it help us point out the length of pauses in drama? An upper dot would point out a short pause, a middle dot would point out a medium pause, and a bottom dot would point out a long pause. Mistake again. And just like that, the birth of punctuation. Punctuation was born. Punctuation as a word came from the Latin word, the Greek word punctus, which means point in Greek. And it would point to readers where to stop. And the three marks that were introduced were the comma, the colon, and the periodus, right? But they were all basically an upper dot, a middle dot, and a bottom dot. And why did they have them? Because back in the day, it was all about oral tradition. People used to read things and writing was meant for casual reading. It was meant for smart people who would express something to not so smart people, which is the majority of humanity at the time, and probably the majority of humanity in our days. So that's how it started. The Greeks, of course, started it, as they had started pretty much a lot of things, right? But then the Romans came, and the Romans did not particularly like the Greeks because, as the legend says, Romans are descendants of those who escaped Troy that was burnt to the ground by the Greeks. And because it was also said that the Romans grew up drinking the milk of wolves, and wolves, as you all know, do not forget grudges. And thus, the Romans held it against the Greeks. And one would assume that the Romans decided to let go of commas, surely to spite the Greeks. And as Cicero, the Roman orator, said, commas? What periods? And what colons? Stupid Greeks. Well, he didn't particularly say that, but something along those lines, as he was wrapped and muffled in his shawls. So the Romans basically let go of the commas and the dots and the periods and the semicolons. And that's how it stayed until the medievals came. Now, in the medieval period, we tend to think of the medieval period as dark ages. While it is true that the medieval period did have a lot of, dark spots, there was something going on along those during that time, and particularly in clergy, right? In monasteries and in clergy, there was a lot going on. And the Romans let go of Aristophanes' punctuation, but as Christianity began to spread into Europe, and reading the Psalms and other biblical passages were essential, the idea of having dots returned, because people used to, or the Bible, of course, was handwritten, and the manuscripts were sent to different people, different priests, across Europe. And these priests were not all good at Latin, so they needed, and reading the Psalms, especially the Psalms and other songs during service in the Bible, in church, required that they know exactly when to stop and how to read in front of an audience. So the idea of dots at the top of end of a word, center and bottom, got back, right? So the Greeks, the dots were the only indications of pauses. So the Greeks brought this idea of having the medieval clergy and medieval Christians had the idea that we should have punctuation. We should bring this punctuation so that people know how to read and when to stop. So it was all for what we call acoustic purposes, right? So they needed that to indicate, how the rhythm of a certain, song or a rhyme would go in the Bible, right? And until that time, of course, the punctuation was still in its primitive stage, right? So there were no spaces between words. For example, letters were all written in caps lock, right? In minuscule letters, which is capital letters. There weren't much that was going on at the time. Now, two periods or two instances happened at that time that did make a difference in the history of punctuation, right? So in the 8th century, we got this one famous king, Charlemagne, showed up, right? So Charlemagne, of course, for those of you who don't know him, he was a very famous French king who was crowned as the defender of Christianity. And of course, we know that he did have instances with the Abbasids, right? So he had some correspondence at the time, and he had a big empire in Europe. That empire consisted of many people of different, of course, races and languages. So he ordered his priests, and particularly Lucin, to introduce a unified script for all his subjects of the Christian kingdom. And that priest introduced a lot of things, including the lowercase and the space. So now writings actually had space between letters, and there's uppercase and there's lowercase. And along with the dots, he also introduced 3 other marks, right? Which is, the punctus, which is the punctus versus, which is an early version of a semicolon, the punctus elevatus, which is an early version of a colon, and then the interrogativus, I hope I'm reading this right, which is an early version of the question mark, right? So we're starting to see something emerging from the 8th century. And the 8th century, basically, to give you some perspective, the 8th century and the 9th century is basically the 200s and the 300s of the Muslim calendar, which is during the Abbasids, the Abbasiyin, right? So this is when they started introducing this. Okay. Now, the other incident that made a big difference was in the 12th century. So punctuation remained the same throughout the medieval period and was mostly haphazard, right? And it was mostly used to help people read out loud, right? Until the development of university books. When we started seeing university books and centers and more manuscripts were printed, then we began to see more careful attention being paid to punctuation. And of course, something amazing happened, which was printing. When printing came, things changed. Right? So this is basically what happened during the medieval period. During the Greeks, they started something very simple. They, just dots, very simple. And then the Romans stopped it. The medievals came. They wanted to use the Greeks punctuation because it was very important to them to help priests read the Bible to general people across Europe. And then, of course, Charlemagne came, a famous Christian empire. He had a emperor, and he had a Christian empire, and he wanted to unify, the way people read the Bible. And then he introduced, and he commissioned people to introduce more punctuation marks. So that's what we got up to the medieval period. Okay, then, of course, the Renaissance came. And the Renaissance, things started flipping, right? The Renaissance, a lot of things in Europe started changing, the early modern period, right? And the three main things that had a print on punctuation are basically humanism and the invention of printing and the idea of a vernacular that began to shape. So humanism, what does humanism mean? Humanism, basically, when it started, it meant that human beings or people should focus on themselves, should look at themselves as the center of the universe in a way, because that's God's given right. They should focus on improving themselves in this world by themselves. This is very different from the classics or the people before that, when the clergy was dominant and it was always about looking towards the other life. All right. The other thing that was invented at the time was printing. Right. So printing became a big thing, and with printing, of course, more people began. Books were more available, and books were more available. More people began to be interested in reading, and the more people got interested, the more printing press came. And then, of course, we also began to see the idea of regionalism, right? So instead of looking at itself as one empire, one Christian empire, we began to see regionalism. So people were in different places thought of themselves as distinct and unique, and that they have different language. They don't have Latin as a unified language. It was a different language. And of course, with all that, humanism meant that more people are reading and educating themselves. Printing meant more people are reading and educating themselves. And then regionalism and the vernacular introduced nationalism of all sorts and small kingship. And basically, it made more people interested in reading and educating themselves. So this whole movement of awakening, and that's why it's called the Renaissance, right? So the awakening that we are something, that we can do something, that we can change ourselves, looking at ourselves. And of course, the center of all this is what? Books. And printing books meant that, there's an urgent call for a more unified system of punctuation. All right. So a lot of things happened during the Renaissance, and it was basically a fight arena with everybody introducing something, taking it back, and all that stuff, and printing. The famous the printers at the time, or the publishers at the time, basically printed exactly what the manuscripts had. But then there was no unified system until we had three main, figures, or four figures that made something very, very interesting, right? The first one was William Caxton, and he is the first one to print books in English, and the first person, of course, also to print the religious books in English, right? And he went ahead to introduce three more punctuation marks. So far we had only three: the period, the semicolon, and the colon. The period basically meant a long pause. The semicolon meant a medium pause, and the comma meant a short pause. But then, of course, now he started, William Caxton started something else. He started a stroke for marking word groups, which is clauses. He introduced something called the colon, and he introduced the period. Now, what he did was slightly different, and I want you to pay attention to that. He went slightly different than what was going on at the time. So as you can see here, the stroke or the colon or the period are no longer for indicating when to pause for priests. It actually meant that a sentence is done or a group of words is done. So we are more veering towards what we call a syntax, right? So how is the word or when is the sentence finished? It finishes at this point. What comes after that? So he introduced these to kind of give the readers an idea of a syntax. Because why? Because, and we will see this when we talk about Arabic, because he thought that the more we have, people reading, especially English readers, the more we will have people confused of where is the stop and where is the, and how some, how a text is particularly read, right? Because people were just being introduced to reading at the time. It wasn't something that was known. Back in the day, it was only the priests who did the reading to large audience. All right, so that's the first person. The other person is, of course, Claude Garmont, and he did a lot of things, but he introduced more quotation marks, and he introduced the fonts. So he introduced Roman type, he introduced the quotation marks, he introduced the baseline, the typeface, etc. Right? So baseline, basically the line where that letters should be all in, like in the middle of the letter. So he introduced a lot of things, and then as we can see now, things are beginning more to expand and take shape, and punctuations are getting more closer to what we have nowadays in mind. All right, and then of course we got from Italy, Aldus and Aldo, right? Aldus and his grandson, they popularized Greek literature and introduced pocket versions to Italians, right? And as such, they established what was already circulated, punctuation. So they made it very common. So people, the more they read, the more they understood what a comma, what a semicolon is, what a period is, and of course, we started having italics. And of course, what these writers did, in addition, or publishers did, in addition to the previous ones, is they took more attention or paid more attention to introduce, punctuation to mark syntax, right, rather than, oratory function. So, the colon or the period doesn't just mean stop anymore. It meant that this is an end of a sentence, right? So that's something that we had here. And I want you to pay attention to this, because when we talk about Arabic, we're going to have a little bit of the same stuff. Okay, so that's what the Renaissance did. Things began to shape according to the way we look at it, and it began to materialize and establish. And by the 17th century or late 17th century, most of the punctuation marks are already present. However, there were different ways of using them, and everybody was going, and they developed across cultures in different ways, mostly similar, but sometimes slightly different. Now, what matters to us, here is that, how did the English, or how did the English language how did it deal with the punctuation, right? Well, the short answer to this is, especially during Shakespeare's time, the Elizabethan drama, and prior to that, actually, the function of punctuation was still, as we can say, archaistic. So what does that mean? It means that it was for the function of teaching readers and dramatists or actors when to pause, when to continue, and for the purposes of reading out loud, right? So that people can see or can listen, right? And of course, Shakespeare is, if you look at Shakespeare's manuscripts, you'll find a lot of, that the majority of the punctuation used there was for the purpose of allowing readers readers to know when to pause and to maintain the rhythm of whatever poem or lines that he is saying. And of course, then came Ben Jonson and the Fowlers. And these two people basically sealed the deal. Now, what did Ben Jonson do? Ben Jonson came and he is credited with establishing grammar, lexicon, and punctuation, right? So that's what he did. So he has a famous book called The English Grammar. And in this book, he formalized syntax and the syntax use of punctuation. All right. Which is basically what we know today, right? Mostly. And then after that, the Fowlers came, and they came in 1906. And if you know if you know history, of course, all of you know, at that time, the British Empire was at its peak, and it controlled most of the planet. And at that time, of course, people began to speak English. English became very common. And of course, the British began to fear for their language, and they decided that we need to have what we call a king's language, right? Or a king's language, or a queen's tongue, right? So this is basically the pure British, tongue that has no accent. This is how it's supposed to be said, right? And of course, they formalize it and they spread it, right? So the reference point of what is perfect English is basically the tongue of the queen. And of course, in 906, they published the King's English. And of course, Henry in particular had a lot of work with the Oxford Dictionary, and he did a lot of work to promote English in general, and English grammar, and of course, English punctuation, the way we see it. Nowadays, what we have is basically the version that we see here. Of course, we got American English, we got British English, but that's basically similar in many ways, and they all spring from the same source. And the similarities are just, or the differences are very, very minimal, like the Oxford comma, for example, and stuff like that. All right. So basically, that's what we got here. Now this is what we did. We started, in the beginning, it was the Greeks, and Aristophanes introduced only 3 dots, and then it developed a little bit. The Romans cut it off. It died right here. And then the medievals took over and introduced more punctuation marks. And in the early modern period, things exploded and all the punctuation marks began to take shape. And by the end of the Renaissance, or the 17th century, all the 14 marks are done. And of course, the English took it and they introduced it to what they have in mind. All right. So now, here we are. Throughout this journey, we are left with 14 punctuation marks, right? These are the 14 most famous common punctuation marks. And we are also left with some revelations, right? So number 1, from this journey, if you notice, punctuation was originally meant to indicate how to read out loud, right? They were not related to syntax. They were not related to sentence. So punctuation wasn't used to indicate a clause or a phrase or an end of a sentence or a beginning of a sentence, beginning of paragraph, end of paragraph. That wasn't originally the function of punctuation. The function of punctuation was about reading loud to an audience. So it would indicate to the reader when to stop and when to talk. Right, so that was the first thing. The other thing that you would notice from this journey is that punctuation developed along the lines of humanism and literature, right? So it was all about, how do we read a drama or a text, right? How do we read a text, whether it was a literary text, of course, or a religious text, and also how do we, as human beings, benefit from reading ourselves? We need to read something ourselves, so we need to know when to stop and when to pause and when to continue reading. So people were interested in learning things themselves, and that's how punctuations gained more importance. And I'll show you something like this when we talk about Arabic punctuation. All right, and then after that, the third thing that we will notice from here is that punctuation was established to establish an empire, right? So Charlemagne, for example, when he established the Christian Empire during the medieval period, he commissioned people to introduce a certain way of writing so that that certain way would be established across the empire, and people will do one or will write in one specific way. That helps people to be unified, because a unified language brings people together and brings better understanding among subjects. And of course, we also see the British, right? So the British finalized the finalized their the punctuation marks, right, and the way they are supposed to be put, simply because they had a big empire and then they wanted to have a reference, pure language, pure way of saying and doing things, right? And of course, punctuation was established to establish empire and to establish religion, right? Because Christianity played a crucial role during the medieval period to maintain this idea of having punctuation. And of course, religion played a role because during the Renaissance, the whole point of allowing people to read was basically to read, or the way they sold it was basically to read religious texts. So we want to read the Bible ourselves, right? We don't want someone to read it for us. We want to read it ourselves, right? And it was only, if you notice, in the 20th century that punctuation became actually a big deal, right? In the early 20th century, that's when we have things that were set on stone and became a king's language to have proper punctuation, proper grammar, and proper pronunciation, basically. All right. So that's what we have here, and that's a journey of punctuation in English, right? It started from the Greeks, as you can see, and it took more than 2,000 years to develop, or maybe almost 2,000 years to develop. So now, as you can see, they are very solid issue. They're very solid, very strong. Language in English or writing in English is unthinkable without punctuation marks. Okay, now let's move on to Arabic, right? Now, when we talk about Arabic and we talk about punctuation marks, well, the reality is that Arabs did not know punctuation prior to the 20th century, right? Now, prior to that, Arabs did not know the accent. And prior to that, they did not know dots on top of letters. So the Arabic script went through something similar but different, right? So if you look at the first picture here, or the first photo here, this is a letter written on behalf of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And basically, as you can see, there is no accents. There are no accents. There are no dots. And it was just a plain text, right? As you can see here, nothing, right? And the idea was back in the day was that, well, anybody who reads that would be able to understand it because Arabs know their language, know their tongue, right? So they would be able to read it. Now, a good example to that is that if you read this, this has no letters, no dots, no accents, right? No harakat, and you can read it. We can probably read it properly. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله. So here we can read this without the letters and without the accents and without the dots. Right? But then, as the Islamic Empire began to expand, the Umayyads and the Abbasids began to expand, we face something that is similar to what other scripts went through, right? So people began, or Arabs or Arab speakers began to worry that people will not be able to read the Quran properly. They will read the Quran in different ways. So they introduced, things began to develop, or the Arabic script began to develop as a result of caring for the Quran. People wanted to take care of the Quran. They wanted to make sure that people read the Quran properly. And that's how things developed, because, not everybody reads Quran. Not everybody is an Arab. And if you notice, this is very similar to how the script and how punctuation developed in Europe, because back in the day, when Christianity spread across Europe, priests worried that Europeans who do not speak Latin, or Europeans who are not from Italy, would not be able to read the Bible properly. So that's how punctuation started in Europe. Here we have something similar. We started to have the dots that were introduced by Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali to maintain proper Quranic pronunciation, the far-flung Muslim empire. And then as time moved on, we have Al-Khalil ibn Ahmed al-Farahidi, who for similar reasons, I'm sorry for the horrible typos, by the way, for similar reasons, added the harakat, right? The accents to add some aesthetic value to reading. All right, so that's how it developed. And now when we think about Arabic script, think about with me, right? If we think about Arabic script, it is unthinkable without harakat and without dots, right? In a similar way, the punctuation is unthinkable in English script. English script is unthinkable without punctuation, right? So we see something similar but different, right? So that's how, to contextualize it, this is how punctuation is important in English. It's the same way we write. When we write in Arabic, we write accents, harakat, and dots. It is crucial. That's the same case with punctuation in English. All right. Now, what about punctuation in Arabic, and when was that introduced? Well, the answer is very simple. Punctuation, علامات الترقيم, right, was introduced in Arabic by Ahmed Zaki Basha in 1912, where he introduced الترقيم وعلاماته في اللغة العربية. All right, and he basically borrowed it from Europe. All right, and adopted it in his book. So basically, all of the things that the colon, the semicolon, everything was imported from Europe and adopted into Arabic. Right, but as you can see, this is something that is very, very recent. Before that, if you look at texts before 1912, Arabic texts, you will not see these points, these punctuation marks. It's just probably 100 years ago. That's all. The punctuation marks were only 100 years old, and even though Ahmed Zaki introduced it at the time, it took a long time until Mujamma al-Lugha al-Arabiyya adopted this. I think it was like in the late 30s or something. So what we have here basically is something that is fairly novice, fairly new to Arabs, and a lot of Arabs are still, trying to understand it. Although they study it, although they learn it, but they still don't practice it, because look at the Quran, for example. There are no punctuation marks in the Quran, yet the Quran is read without the need for these punctuation marks. Although in the Quran, by the way, if you notice, they have all the signs to indicate pauses, right? So we have qala, and we have ja, which means jawaz al-waqf, which means wujub al-waqf. We have salah, wujub al-wasl, right? So all these small notices in the Quran just indicate, the aesthetic reading, the aesthetic way of reading Quran, the tajweed of the Quran, basically. All right. Okay. So now where do we stand? All right. Basically, I want to go back to answering my question. Right. So why do Arabs find it difficult to adopt or to work with punctuation marks? All right. Well, my answer to this question is understanding the history of punctuation allows us to see why many Arabs have problems with punctuation in English. Why? Because it is something that developed in a totally different sphere. It wasn't developed in the Arabic. It's not original to the Arabic language. It just came later. Another thing is, I just threw out a couple of reasons as well, but you can always add during the discussion. Punctuation in Arabic is not as drastically alternating as in English, so that's another thing. The historical perspective of punctuation does not allow us to see the importance of punctuation to English writing, because we never really used it. We Arabs are introduced to the marks only recently. The acoustic versus the syntax use of punctuation marks is not established in Arabic as it is in English. And of course, the versions of punctuation marks Ahmed Zaki introduced are slightly different from that of English, right? There's some alternations, and until now, we're still having that. The discussion continues on what does every mark exactly mean. I particularly, for example, have a problem explaining to students the difference between a full stop and a comma, because in Arabic, a comma sometimes can indicate the end of a sentence, whereas in a full stop, while in English, a comma is a totally different thing. So that's just one of the examples that I have, and I can talk more when we discuss during the Q&A session. All right, and with that, I reached the conclusion of our journey. So we started with the Greeks, moved on to the medieval period, to the Renaissance, to the English, to where it stands right now, and we talked a little bit about, where does the punctuation idea stand in Arabic, and then we ended up with explaining why do Arabs, basically answering the question, why do Arabs find difficulty in using punctuation marks? Thank you.